So a lot of us are expecting a new MacBook Air and a new base MacBook Pro to drop at the end of the year with M2. Now today we have some information about that, right from some details regarding the M2 SoC and also what to expect with these new Macs. Right, so beginning with the M2 SoC, Mark Gurman spilled the beans on everything we need to know, and basically the M2 should have an 8-core CPU much like the M1, with 4 power cores and 4 efficiency cores. Now the actual cores of the M2 should have a slightly higher clock speed because they should be based on the A15. Now this does mean that in terms of CPU performance, the M2 should be a pretty small upgrade over M1. Much like the A-series SoCs for the last few years, expect a pretty small 10 to 20% performance upgrade. However, Gurman does say the GPU should see a massive boost. It should now be a 10-core GPU, that's 2 more cores over the M1, and it should also have a slightly higher clock speed because the GPU cores will be based on the A15. Now, by the way, some of you were asking me the differences between M2 and M1X, so let me explain that real quick. So let's begin with the M1X. This is for prosumers, so it's going to be in the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pro, the iMac Pro possibly, and of course, the redesigned Mac Mini. Now, much like the name hints at, this should be based on the M1, so the same cores, but you get more of everything. So you have more power cores, you have more GPU cores, and specifically, you get twice the amount of CPU cores and up to 4 times the amount of GPU cores. So the same clock speed for each core, but you have more, which means obviously it's way more powerful. Whereas M2 should be in the entry-level Macs. So basically everything that has an M1 right now, so the base MacBook Pro, the MacBook Air, the base Mac Mini, and the 24-inch iMac, those will get M2, and basically this should be very similar in terms of layout to the M1, like I mentioned before, so 4 power cores and 4 efficiency cores, but you get the updated A15 cores, which have a slightly higher clock speed. Now yes, I know that Apple has not confirmed the naming and they could really go with anything, but this makes the most sense because they did implement this with the A-series chips. For example, when the iPads had the X variant of the A-series chip, they were slightly behind the iPhone in terms of the number, but they were actually faster than the newer iPhone SoCs. So for example, the A13 was actually slightly weaker than the A12X. And so much like that, M2 will be weaker than M1X because M1X might have older cores, but it has more of them. It has a 32-core GPU, it has 8 power cores, so obviously it's going to be way faster, but that does make sense because it's built for the prosumer machines, whereas M2 is catering towards the entry-level market. Hopefully that clarified a few things for you guys, and with that being said, let's now delve into what's happening with the base MacBook Pro. So this again is something people are confused about, but basically the 14-inch MacBook Pro that we could see at WWDC with M1X will not be replacing the M1 MacBook Pro that starts at $1,300. That won't be touched for the time being, and instead, the 14-inch replaces the Intel 4-port 1799 13-inch MacBook Pro that Apple currently sells. Now this does make a ton of sense because Apple's always had 2 tiers to the 13-inch MacBook Pro lineup, a higher-end version and a lower-end version that historically doesn't get all the features and new designs immediately. For example, when the Retina MacBook Pro was released, Apple also released a cheaper non-Retina unibody MacBook Pro, but with the older design and a cheaper price. Now rumors do suggest the same thing too, because Mark Gurman says the low-end 13-inch MacBook Pro should get a chip upgrade, and so that does lead me to believe that the M1 MacBook Pro should get an M2 upgrade, but it will definitely not be getting a new design because note, Gurman does not say low-end 14-inch, he does not say redesigned low-end MacBook Pro, he just says 13-inch low-end model, and so that does lead me to believe that there won't be any redesign, and Alex on Twitter also confirms this, so yeah, this is pretty likely. Now yes, I know this goes by Apple's tradition, but I don't think this makes any sense, and I have a few issues with the base 13-inch MacBook Pro's place in the lineup that I want to delve into. So the first issue with the lack of a redesign is the touch bar, because obviously we all know by now that Apple is removing the touch bar on the higher end 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pro due to the controversy surrounding the touch bar and how prosumers pretty much hate it. And so typically when Apple's removing a pretty controversial feature on one model, they apply that to the rest of the lineup as well. For example, when Apple introduced the Magic Keyboard on the 16-inch MacBook Pro, Apple within a few months got rid of all the butterfly keyboards because, of course, it was pretty controversial to say the least, and Apple essentially wanted to erase it from history. And so it's going to be really weird that the higher end 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pro don't have a touch bar, and yet the lower end 13-inch has one. That will just be really odd, and it's going to create a lot of confusion because obviously Apple has always touted the touch bar as a premium feature. That's pretty much what differentiates the M1 MacBook Air and the M1 MacBook Pro. And so again, wouldn't it be odd that a premium feature is offered on the $1,300 MacBook Pro and yet is nowhere to be seen on the more expensive MacBook Pros? But that's not really the main issue. The bigger issue has to be the M2 MacBook Air, because we've heard tons of rumors about a new MacBook Air with M2, mini LED, new colors, a thinner and lighter design, and MagSafe. Now obviously the MacBook Air has always slotted underneath the MacBook Pro, and so again, how does it make any sense that the cheaper MacBook Air has MagSafe, mini LED, new colors, a new design over the M2 MacBook Pro? Now yes, I know that mini LED might be pushed back because of all the supply constraints, but even without mini LED, you still have a newer design and some other newer features that just simply make it the superior product. In fact, you would only buy the M2 Pro for black bezels and the touch bar, which is going to be a pretty niche market. So on the whole, I don't agree with these leaks, and so let's delve into what I think could happen with the M2 MacBook Pro. So number one is pretty obvious, the leaks are wrong. Maybe the M2 MacBook Pro at the end of the year does gain the new design, and maybe it has less ports, and maybe slightly worse battery life, but most importantly, it will be on par with the M2 MacBook Air in terms of design and features, but also there will be no touch bar, so the lineup is uniform. However, in my opinion, what I think is more likely is that the base MacBook Pro just dies. I know it's a pretty controversial take, but let me explain why I think this. So the base MacBook Pro was created purely because the Air was severely underpowered, and if you were looking for a computer that could do basic video editing and photo editing and coding without breaking the bank, you could go for the base MacBook Pro. But now with M1, that's no longer the case because the MacBook Air is incredibly powerful. I use a MacBook Air to edit videos and it's perfect, and so this machine can definitely be used for pro level use. In fact, we've seen the benchmarks. The M1 MacBook Air and the M1 MacBook Pro are very, very similar in terms of performance, and so there really is no longer a need for a more powerful entry-level Mac, because the entry-level MacBook Air is perfectly fine for most people. And so in my opinion, I see the future lineup looking like this. I think the base M1 MacBook Air with the 7-core GPU stays maybe at $900, and then we have the M2 MacBook Air at $1,100. In fact, maybe this is renamed to just the MacBook, because obviously the new design loses the iconic wedge-shaped design, and so I'm inclined to believe this might just be the M2 MacBook. But anyways, I think that MacBook could be perfect for pretty much any entry-level Mac user, even those looking to do more intensive stuff with their Mac. And so in my opinion, Apple can comfortably get rid of the base MacBook Pro and start the MacBook Pro lineup at $1,799. Those are my thoughts, but let me know your thoughts on this matter in the comments below. Anyways, thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe for the latest Apple news and rumors. Check out the video in the icon above about my unboxing and first impressions on the M1 iPad Pro. And on that note, I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya, peeps.